George Bush has a jubilant homecoming to Beijing, renewing old friendships and trying to build a new relationship with China. This is the CBS Evening News. Bob Schieffer reporting. Good evening. A big event in Chinese-American relations. That's how the Chinese leaders were describing President Bush's visit today, and it was an assessment the administration shared at Beijing and a banquet tonight. The new president said, "The world is watching the larger movement of our two great nations as we build even firmer bonds." We begin tonight's report from Beijing, where Dan Rather is heading up our China coverage.
Good evening. This is the second leg of the president's Asian tour. It's a sentimental return for the Bushes, his fifth trip here. He arrived saying, "There's an openness in China I would never have predicted 15 years ago."
Okay, fellas.
The president arrived in Beijing and drove straight to Tiananmen Square, the political heart of the People's Republic.
Hi, how are you?
George Bush headed the American mission here in the mid-1970s. In those days, the Cultural Revolution was still the rage. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese marched through the square, shouting the thoughts of Mao from the pages of their red books. Experiments in capitalism seemed light years away then, and it would have been inconceivable for an American president to come here directly from Japan.
Say hello? Okay, say hello to this guy.
This is a vastly different China. A huge portrait of Mao still hangs from the front gate to the Forbidden City. Mao's successors have kept the picture, but discarded the policies.
China is moving away from the days in which you had charismatic leaders, an ideology that people believed in, a closed door that made hierarchical totalitarian politics possible.
Today's Chinese leaders have initiated dramatic economic reforms. They were trying perestroika before Gorbachev even came to power in Moscow. But they have 1 billion mouths to feed and not enough food. 1 billion consumers who can't always afford what they see in the stores.
There's a lot of change, but in some sense, perceptions may be going faster than the pace of change. There are a lot of people who feel that the change is too rapid and are trying to hold it back.
China is trying rapid strategic and diplomatic changes as well. 3 weeks ago, Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze was here. Arrangements were made for the first Sino-Soviet summit in 30 years. Mikhail Gorbachev gets here in mid-May. Both Gorbachev and President Bush can read the numbers. China has vast military potential, vast economic and trade potential. There are hundreds of millions of potential customers for American products here. In the 17 years since President Nixon broke the diplomatic freeze between the United States and mainland China, the United States has become the second largest investor here and China's third largest trading partner, behind Hong Kong and the Japanese. The United States, China, and the Soviet Union are all redefining their relationships with one another and with Japan. It is against this backdrop that the president came to China from Tokyo. Bill Plant reports.
For a long time, China was viewed by U.S. policymakers as a nation to be leveraged against its major enemy, the Soviet Union. That was called playing the China card. But no more. On his way here today, President Bush called that notion highly offensive and declared it passé.
But we've passed the day on the U.S.-China relationship where anyone talks about, quote, playing a card. Our relationship, the China-U.S. relationship, stands on its own.
Maybe so, but the Soviets, who share thousands of miles of border with China, are still very much a part of this picture, particularly at a time when Moscow's relations with Washington have been warming up.
Whenever the United States and the Soviet Union have an improvement in relations, have somewhat of a détente, the Chinese have been uneasy because they feel they're kind of left out.
Not to worry. Old China hand George Bush has a reassuring message for his friends here.
We're not going to move forward in a way that would denigrate their interests or diminish the bilateral relationship between China and the United States.
But wait, the Russians are coming. Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze was here earlier this month to begin repairing the 30-year-old split between the two communist giants. Still not to worry. President Bush says that's no problem either.
This visit next spring is a good thing, and it's nothing detrimental to the interests of the United States in that regard.
U.S. policymakers think that China has already moved too far along its own path to ever again unite with the Soviets to challenge the U.S., particularly now that economic problems are forcing China, the Soviets, and the United States to look inward rather than at one another. Bill Plant, CBS News, Beijing.
Mr. Bush is pursuing serious big power diplomacy here, as Bill Plant reported, but he is also genuinely enjoying a visit to an old home city and lobbying hard over a 12,000-mile communications link, trying behind the scenes to save the John Tower appointment back in Washington. White House correspondent Leslie Stahl reports on that.
To remind George Bush of life in Beijing when he was an envoy here 15 years ago, Chinese Premier Li Peng gave him a bicycle, which is how the Bushes, Mr. and Mrs., got around town in those days. The president gave the premier something in return, one of the 4 pairs of cowboy boots he brought to give Chinese leaders.
We owe it to mankind to work together for peace and international stability.
Tonight, an official banquet, ceremonial paces. But in fact, Bush and company have become the great traveling lobbying machine, working the phones in a last-ditch effort to save the John Tower nomination.
It's not too little too late. I'll be talking to whomever has any kind of an open mind on this question. I'll do it personally, and I'll do it as forcefully as I can.
One of his aides admits that the task of battening down the votes of every single Republican in the Senate and winning 5 Democrats will be extremely difficult.
They say this is the second time you've been shot down in the Pacific.
It's an interesting analogy.
He challenged the idea that the tower flap has ruined his trip.
And if it's beclouded by some political battle back home right now, so be it. But what we're doing is laying the groundwork for the security interests of the United States.
Back in Washington on Tuesday, the president will meet one by one with more than a dozen senators. Then on the day of the votes as an aide, there'll be a reassessment about withdrawing the nomination if it's certain the president's going to lose. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, Beijing.
The last American president to visit China was Ronald Reagan 5 years ago. The United States may not seem as different. One Republican has followed another to the White House, but China has changed. More economic freedom, more artistic freedom. Bruce Morton has a look at the China returning visitor George Bush is seeing.
Once people here did traditional Tai Chi in the gray early morning light. Now there's almost a disco beat, Jane Fonda, Beijing style. A little rock and roll, a little capitalism. Once the rule for haircuts here was one style fits all. Now they soap and shape and blow dry and seek inspiration where they find it. Zhang Yanru started her shop in 1985. 10 years ago, the government wouldn't have allowed it. Inflation hasn't affected me at all. Even the government is getting into the capitalism business. This office is selling apartments. It's the first time ordinary Chinese have had a chance to own property. The terms would startle Americans. To buy a house, you must put all your money down, 100% in cash up front. For an average couple, the apartments, tiny by U.S. standards, cost about 20 years' salary, usually savings plus whatever they can borrow. Sales are brisk. Yang Chantao, a singer in the Army, and his wife say they could raise the money. You must have permanent residency in Beijing, and us Army people don't have that. All this capitalism has changed the look of the city. When Ronald Reagan came here in 1984, streets were rivers of bicycles. They wait now for cars. And there's a new freedom in the arts. I want to bring out sensitive subjects in my art. Sensitive? This sculptor in formerly puritanical Beijing is showing a sculpture made of condoms at an avant-garde show the police first closed, then let reopen. This show might have had a hard time in New York. Change, as you may have noticed, is busting out all over here. The question is, where does China go from here? The economy is a crazy quilt. Heavily subsidized rents for most people, but inflation here in the marketplace. As for politics, what happens after Deng Xiaoping, nobody knows. The city just keeps changing and growing. There are traces of the old China still, of course, but change is what this place is all about. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Beijing.
Bob Schieffer will be back with more news from China and the rest of the day's news in a moment.
also the focus of our Washington notebook tonight, and as we learned this week, it is a visit that comes at a propitious juncture in Sino-American relations.
I think the relationship is in very good shape. Fresh breezes are moving through Washington, perhaps even through the State Department, and that there's at least a possibility that a new and better direction will take place.
That being the case, there is reason for optimism. A major goal of both countries is to improve economic ties. The economy, not politics, is the engine driving the Chinese machine. The Chinese want access to U.S. markets and U.S. investment. The U.S. wants reassurance the economic reforms now sweeping China are here to stay.
Our relationship to China, I think, focuses on these changes, on the dynamism of the system, on the future of a country that will be very important in our history, and for whose ascendancy we really need to prepare.
Sino-American relations have been good, very good, for 15 years, improving, in fact. Now I think they've topped out. And there's some problems that have been coming into view.
One problem, China is the 5th largest arms exporter in the world. The United States is unhappy about the sale of ballistic missiles to Saudi Arabia and silkworm missiles to Iran. China is unhappy that the United States won't share its high technology.
Caution is in order in the U.S.-Chinese relationship, and it is not necessarily so that we should play the Chinese card at any cost at all, and especially when it comes to the transfer to them of very high technology.
Another problem. China is experiencing social unrest similar to that inside the Soviet Union. Recent U.S. charges of human rights abuses in Tibet were viewed by the Chinese as unwelcome interference in domestic affairs. And don't forget Taiwan. The Chinese still hope to reunite Taiwan with the mainland, and the United States still sells Taiwan arms. What to do about Taiwan remains a major point of contention, which shows no sign yet of being resolved.
We have to remember that China has an independent foreign policy that is designed for China. It may coincidentally be one that fits our purposes, but clearly not necessarily.
And that is why those who open the door to the current relationship with China expect only modest gains as a result of President Bush's visit.
The most important thing that can happen between the Chinese and American leaders is that they understand how each of them sees the world, and hopefully that on fundamentals, not on tactics, they see it more or less the same.
Henry Kissinger, whose secret trip to China in 1971 began the chain of events that led to the restoration of Sino-American relations. After Kissinger's visit came the Richard Nixon trip to China, and one of the reporters with him, of course, was Dan Rather. Well, Dan, I suppose it looks much different this time around than it did, what, 17 years ago?
It does, Bob. There are more automobiles. The people are dressed more colorfully. There's been a great deal of building here, and the construction, by the way, to my eye, looks to be more solid than new construction in the Soviet Union. In many ways, it's a different planet, mainland China, today than it was when President Nixon came here in 1972.
Dan, let me ask you about the story that is causing so much comment in Washington now, and that is the John Tower nomination. John Tower will begin a big public relations blitz beginning tomorrow. He'll make a speech at the National Press Club and so on. They're saying the Secretary of Defense nominee is going on the offense. What are you hearing about all this, and how concerned is President Bush about it? And does he intend to stick with John Tower through all this?
He intends to stick with him through all this. What you hear is that there are two camps in the staff of the president. It's the president's call. He owes John Tower a lot, by the way. John Tower is one of the people who helped George Bush get the job as head of mission here in China in the mid-1970s. The two camps are, one is, listen, we should have gotten out of this thing a long time ago, and John Tower should have taken the president off the hook 3 weeks ago. That's one camp. The other camp, led by John Sununu, is, listen, all the way, you don't give up. Even if we go to a fight on the Senate floor and lose it, we will win in the long pull because the public will be behind us. Now, what they're going to do, one member of the staff said at the airport, only half-jokingly yesterday, listen, we're going to let John Tower do the best he can to sell himself. That only Pat Sajak will be on television more than John Tower over the next few days. Then the night before the vote in the Senate, they're going to take a look at the votes, try to count, And at that time, there'll be another run made by those who want to get out of the nomination and say, look, don't take it to the floor. Don't press this thing all the way. Now, Tower's argument is going to be, let he who hasn't done these things cast the first stone. And that's the way they're going to play it. It has been very heavy over this trip, Bob. They've tried to cover it up, but the president's been answering telephone calls in the middle of the night, making some calls in the middle of the night, and they're concerned about it. But George Bush owes John Tower so much that his view is unless Tower quits, and nobody expects that, they're going to take it all away.
All right. Thank you, Dan. And we'll be back with more news in just a moment. Tonight. Today, the hunt was on for clues and 9 missing passengers. Jerry Bowen in Honolulu has the latest.
The Coast Guard continues to search the ocean off Hawaii for debris and victims from United Flight 811. So far, 2 airplane seats and a large piece of metal have been recovered, which may help determine if structural failure caused the jumbo jet to rip open at 23,000 feet over the Pacific, sending 9 passengers to their deaths. NTSB officials say only that it's one factor being explored by the investigating committee.
It will look for any aspects of sabotage. It will examine the door systems, document the cargo area.
A bomb-caused rupture of the right side cargo door and passenger cabin seems increasingly unlikely. Passengers heard no explosion.
All I can remember is a ripping noise, and maybe that's after the fact, I'm not sure. And I looked up, and the seats were gone.
I heard this whooshing noise, then a crack, a large crack, and large cracking sound, and then I turned around. The debris was everywhere, and the side of the plane was blown out.
The tearing is too clean. If it was an explosive device, it would be much more torn and perforated.
Former FAA Inspector Carl Hutchinson says the rectangular opening points to a problem with the cargo door itself.
The lower sill portion and frame in which the lower latches are attached appears to be intact. If the door is properly locked, it would have taken all of that locking mechanism with it.
U.S. airlines have been under FAA orders to inspect and reinforce cargo door locks on 747s since a door on another plane opened in flight. But the door lock on United 811 had yet to be fixed.
But we don't feel that that is an issue here. We don't feel that that part is an issue here in this incident.
Last night, many of the original passengers resumed their trips to New Zealand, but not without apprehension.
Well, they say lightning don't strike twice, so we'll see.
And investigators will inspect the crippled United jet to see if the tragedy was purely accidental or avoidable. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Honolulu.
In South Africa, a 14-year-old black youth who was a militant leader of his generation was buried today. No one was blamed in public for the death, but one name was on everyone's mind. Martha Teichner has that report.
During an all-night vigil, Stompie Moketse's Children's Army paid their respects to the boy general who led them. Their militance was deliberately controlled when he was buried today, a conscious attempt to turn down the heat on a crisis that has already cost lives. Stompie's is one of the few activists' funerals that hasn't been banned under South Africa's 3-year-old state of emergency. The reason? The government gets political mileage out of the fact that Winnie Mandela's football team bodyguards have been accused of killing him. Mrs. Mandela's name was never mentioned at today's funeral, although deep community resentment of her was evident.
How can we lie asleep when 14-year-olds are dying?
Despite the obvious anger and bitterness at the funeral, church leaders urged restraint.
If there are those who have come to stoke up the fires of retaliation, go home because you do him no honor.
But already the spiral of revenge has begun. It is feared Stompie's funeral is only the first, not the last. Martha Teichner, CBS News, Tumaholu.
Foreign Minister Shevardnadze today became the highest-ranking Soviet official to visit Iran since the Islamic Revolution. He hopes to meet tomorrow with the Ayatollah Khomeini. Earlier, he met in Iraq with President Hussein. The Soviet Union was Iraq's main backer during the Iran-Iraq War. Thousands demonstrated today outside the New York City offices of Viking Press, American publisher of the Satanic Verses. They carried placards praising Ayatollah Khomeini and an effigy of author Salman Rushdie. The protesters chanted death threats against Rushdie and insisted his book is insulting to Muslims. journalists riding into Beijing from the airport today couldn't help but notice the latest open-air proof of change in China. Well, that's John Shahan's cue, and here's his report.
It's less than 2 years since The Music Man came to China, with its lead character, Harold Hill, deploring the depravity of billiards. When the bogus professor sang the Mandarin version of "You've got trouble with a capital T, that rhymes with P and that stands for pool," pool was a game the Chinese hardly knew.
Well, Professor Hill, your dire warning went unheeded. Suddenly, all over the country, the Chinese have turned billiards into a national craze. According to sports equipment manufacturers, China now has more pool fanatics than ping pong players.
Almost anywhere you go, there are people playing taicho, literally platform ball, at a cost of about 26 cents a game. This Beijing theater increased its income 50% by introducing billiards. Its 9 tables are taking in a staggering $65,000 a year. In 1987, the Beijing Sports Equipment Company had 5 workers making pool tables. Now it has 50. Depending on quality, the tables sell for between $250 and $4,000. The official Chinese press has started calling for a crackdown. The papers call pool unhealthy, alleging that players are betting on the games. They warn that young pool players are neglecting their studies and trying to imitate Americans. The criticism is like an echo of The Music Man. Youth is being corrupted by pool. Or, as Harold Hill says, we've got trouble with a capital T. John Shahan, CBS News, Beijing.
And that's the news. Susan Spencer will be here tomorrow, and later tonight on West 57th, Dan Rather will be back live from Beijing with an update on the president's visit to China. I'm Bob Schieffer, CBS News in New York. Good night.
You think my guys are going to be sidelined by a tough sinus cold? Not these Grabowskis. The congestion, the pain, the sinus pressure, as tough as it gets. New maximum strength Tristan is tougher. Tristan unblocks congestion here, sweeps away pressure here and here, knocks out sinus pain. And it won't make you drowsy. That's important. When you're playing with bears, when you can't call in sick, call on Tristan. It's maximum strength relief.
Attention shredded wheat eaters, you've been missing something. Taste, but no more. Kellogg's Squares brings you that superlative shredded wheat nutrition with no salt, no fat, no cholesterol. But wait, Kellogg's Squares gives you free in every bite. Taste. Sweet, delectable fruit in the middle. You might never eat plain old shredded wheat again. Kellogg's Squares, shredded wheat with taste. Free in every bite. And speaking of taste, now Squares have 35% more raisin. Great taste. Free.
Perennial champs, the perennial also-rans. What a difference a year makes. Celtics, Knicks, tomorrow.
This is CBS.